Saturday, March the 7th, 1981, Shabbat Rosh Chodesh, Shabbat Shekalim. The three Sifrei Torah, the three scrolls of the law which we used this morning, represent the three different aspects of the service today. It is, of course, Rosh Chodesh of the second Adar. Reason why we have 2 months of Adar is in order to keep the Jewish calendar, which is a calendar that's based on the moon, a lunar calendar, in line with the solar calendar. Otherwise, we would be celebrating Pesach in midwinter. And if the snow carries on, in fact, we will. So every so often, the Jewish calendar adds another month of Adar, which is why we had 2 months of Adar this year. And people who are unfortunate enough to be born in second Adar don't have birthdays on a regular basis. So don't arrange for your children to be born during that month, because they will hate you for the rest of their lives. I think they only get presents once in 13 years or something like that. Are you a second Adar baby? Huh? The scroll then that was taken out of the ark for Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, deals with the sacrifice that was offered in the temple, the special musaf, the special additional sacrifice which was offered in the temple on new moon, which was picked up in the theme of the Atayat Sarta, which we added to our somewhat attenuated musaf service. Of course, the basic scroll was the scroll that we read from, and the third was for Shabbat Shekalim, which is the first of the special Sabbaths which precede Pesach. At weekly intervals, Shabbat Shekalim is followed by Shabbat Zachor, which immediately precedes Purim, Shabbat Para, the Sabbath which deals with the discussion of the ritual of the red heifer, Shabbat HaChodesh, the special Sabbath relating to the new moon of Nisan, which of course is the special new moon which precedes Passover, and finally Shabbat Hagadol. So there's a great deal of liturgical busyness at this time of the year, and of course the ultimate focal point of all this activity is Passover. Shabbat Shekalim is the reading from that third scroll is from the book of Exodus, and actually in its original form describes a census that was taken of the Israelites in the wilderness, including the injunction that everybody should give machatzit ha-shekel, half a shekel. The idea was that it was regarded as an ill omen or bad luck to count people. Those of you who come from a traditional Orthodox background know that even today in Orthodox synagogues, if people need a minyan, they will not count up to 10. They will say not one in Yiddish, not two. There still is this belief that the evil eye rests on that which is counted. It's a superstition, but it is a superstition that dies very hard. And the idea was that if every male over a certain age gave half a shekel and you counted the number of total shekalim that you had, you would then indirectly find out how many people that you had. Censuses apparently always run into difficulties, whether it's over the question of not wanting to count or people who don't fill out their forms. From the New York Times in recent weeks and various articles that have appeared on the problems of the last census that was taken, it would seem that things haven't improved over the last 3,000 years. It's very difficult to get people to stay still long enough to be counted. One suspects the superstition related to human guilt. We all have things to hide, and we all fear that somehow a census will bring it out into the open. I think ultimately, behind every superstition, there lies an element of fact, just as behind every piece of paranoia there usually is a certain element of truth. And it's curious, of course, that the question of counting should crop up at a time when the question of Yom Kippur appeal or contributions to the Spring Gala is being discussed. I speak, of course, purely in terms of functional equivalence. The issue of Shabbat Shekalim really relates to how much you can afford to give to the maintenance of the Jewish community. Only your income tax advisor knows for sure. All of us devise various stratagems to appear more impoverished than we are in public, so that we will not be pushed for the extra few $100s. And somehow Shabbat Shekalim, Jewish tradition, with an unerring instinct for the jugular, spiritually speaking, begins to raise the entire question several weeks before Passover is celebrated. Well, exactly how much can you afford for this? How much can you give to the maintenance and upholding of the Jewish community? In fact, we have to distinguish between several different levels of the shekel. The shekel in the wilderness, of course, was a kind of a superstitious census shekel, which was quite clearly used in the context of enormous fears relating to the actual counting. The Bible, in fact, records during the time of King David a fearful plague that was believed to have smitten the people because David violated the injunction against counting. So in the biblical period, the counting business was related to very primitive, atavistic superstitions and the distinct belief that any violation would lead to plague and destruction, which in fact happened on several occasions. The later books of the Bible are full of occasions when various kings, especially King David, violated this principle and the people suffered terribly. By the time of the period of Jesus, by the time of the period of the Second Jewish Commonwealth, by the time of the Herodian, the Second Temple, the shekel was used on an entirely different basis. It was used as a form of income tax within a theocratic form of government, which was the way in which the Jewish people constituted itself at that time, what Rabbi Kaplan calls the ecclesiastical period of Jewish life. When the temple stood and the Jewish people regarded itself as a church, there was a need for tithing. There was a need for all kinds of gifts to maintain the fabric of the temple. In a theocracy, the central figure is the high priest. The central institution is the temple, no longer the king and the royal palace. And throughout the ancient Jewish world, it was a mark of pride on the part of Jews to give each year, basically, a minimal sum. In other words, I'm not quite sure what the correct economic term of this is, but I know we have equivalents in American life today. In other words, there are certain taxes that everybody has to pay regardless of how much money you make, and there are certain taxes which are graded according to how much you make. The tithes tended to be contingent upon how much money you made. The shekel was a standard sum. With inflation, it probably is impossible to calculate exactly how much the shekel would be worth today. We'd have to know how many loaves of bread you could buy for a shekel in those days, and even that wouldn't help us too much. So we'll have to leave guesswork outside and simply state that at this time of the year, on the first day of the month of Adar, proclamations went out throughout the Jewish communities of the Second Commonwealth. That is to say, not only the Jewish communities that lived in Palestine, but also those who lived in Egypt, and Italy and Spain and Asia Minor and Babylon, requesting the annual contribution of the shekel which every Jew was supposed to contribute towards the temple. And there being no bankers' orders and checks in those days, the money came in as money. It came in boxes. It was shipped in by road, by mule cart, and by ships from all over the world. We have eyewitness descriptions. The money, in fact, came in, and everybody who called himself a Jew made that contribution. We have eyewitness descriptions of this process taking place as early as the first pre-Christian century, when in a very famous piece of litigation, a Roman proconsul was taken to court, sued, and found guilty for having misappropriated several boxes of shekalim on their way from Asia Minor to Jerusalem. It's a famous trial. Cicero was involved in this trial. So we have a fairly detailed description of the. We can learn from that this was something that was done quite commonly. Of course, there was an attempt when I was young to reintroduce the notion of the shekel on the part of the Zionist organization. It's a great shame that that wasn't done, because what it meant was that everybody who called himself a Jew would give a basic sum. We make a bad mistake, we Jews, when we raise money. We always think we can get a little more, so we raise the ante too high. The best example of Israel bonds, by fixing the lowest cost of an Israel bond at $250, the bond organization effectively preclude people who can't afford that kind of money ever from purchasing a bond. Instead of being intelligent and making $50 bonds or multiples, you're told that if you can't afford $250, we don't want you. And the proof has been the modest sums of money raised in recent years precisely because of that. And I think the same thing is true of UJA Federation. The implication is given that the widow's mite is not called for, that only those who can give massively are really worthwhile. And in fact, sometimes fundraisers rather stupidly indicate that they don't expect to raise money from the rank and file of the Jewish people, they only expect the big givers. And so we have a kind of a tarantella danced around the big givers with a terrible price paid by the Jewish community for having to suck up to people whose sole distinction and claim to fame is money and very little else. And in certain parts of the Jewish world, I have witnessed the decadence of the Anglo-Jewish community over precisely this problem. A great lesson has been missed from Jewish fundraising. You see, the issue in fundraising is not just how much you raise, but the way in which you raise it and the pedagogic, educational, and spiritual impact on the wider Jewish community. When every Jew, no matter how impoverished, feels that their few dollars makes a difference to what is happening in the Jewish community, we add to the fiscal dimension of what is called for the spiritual implication that every Jew feels that he or she is involved creatively in the maintenance of Jewish life and doesn't have to walk around feeling inferior because they can't make massive financial contributions. Now, of course, we need large sums of money, and those who are fortunate enough to have them should be quite happy to share them with us after all said and done. They are part of a community which permits them to earn so much money. But when the poor people, the average man and woman in the street, is not encouraged to feel that he or she is part of an ongoing enterprise in which they matter, and they matter financially also to boot, then a very important psychological cohesive factor is missing from the Jewish people. We can only look at the psychological impact of Shabbat Shekalim to realize what we are talking about. No matter how impoverished a Jew was, we assumed that the shekel was within his grasp. The Bible says quite clearly, He'ashir lo yarbeh v'hadal lo yamit. The rich man may not give more. The poor man may not give less. This does not mean that there are certain occasions when the poor should not have to give at all, or occasions when the rich should have to give exclusively. This is all part of a society. The question, I think, is raised in the New York Times today, that a sad day will come in America when people in Des Moines believe that they shouldn't pay money towards federal funding of public transportation, which they don't need. It's the same argument that is used sometimes more closely to West 86th Street when people say, why should I support the synagogue? I don't have any children who need to go to Hebrew school. It's exactly the same argument. If we believe that there is such a thing as community, then we will also realize that it is simply not possible simply to tax everybody for their needs. In other words, you can't have a taxation system which only takes from you what you're getting. The fact that you're a member of the wider community means you are deriving benefit from being able to function professionally or business-wise in terms of the wider community. Without that wider community, you wouldn't have a leg to stand on, you wouldn't survive for 5 minutes. The robber baron needs the common man in the street. It's a mutual reciprocal need. None of us can manage independently and in isolation. And this argument, when used closer to home, can be devastating. If the only people that support the synagogue have to be those people who actually need the synagogue, we would have no synagogues left. And so therefore the psychological meaning of Shabbat Shekalim is a very important meaning. It means that when synagogues run raffles, when synagogues run activities, the price, if it involves the entire community, should be geared to a price that everybody can afford. I must say that for the most part, the SAJ has been conspicuously successful in raising funds in a democratic, lowercase d, fashion, and I hope we continue. But unfortunately, in the wider Jewish community, and even here occasionally, we also fall foul of the dangers of not understanding the principle of machatzit hashekel, the equality on certain occasions for specific purposes, psychological and spiritual, in Jewish life. And we have picked up again the custom of machatzit hashekel on the eve of Purim, which is the 19th of March, and I hope you will all come in fine fettle and dressed in costume. If you don't come dressed in costume, I will guarantee to make your life a misery for the next 364 days and do a guilt number on you. I note you haven't been warned. Everybody, we even expect Ethel Cohen to come in costume this year. Everybody has to come in costume. There will be 2 boxes outside the synagogue, redolent of the ancient custom of machatzit hashekel. We began this custom last year. This is a custom I remember from my father's synagogue. There were 2 large bowls outside the entrance to the synagogue on the eve of Purim. One was for the one who read the Megillah, and the other was for gifts to the poor. Now, since everybody reads the Megillah here, we have a large... How many do we have currently, Eliezer? How many people are reading the Megillah this year so far? 45? 45 people. Now, we wouldn't want to support 45 people for the machatzit hashekel. So what is happening this year is that one of the boxes, which we hope will be filled to capacity with dollars, we regard everybody is capable of bringing $2 to the synagogue on the eve of Purim. $1 for each box. And I remember in my day in England it used to be half a crown. What a half a crown would, what one of those half crowns would mean today, I suspect, is probably $5. But anyway, half a crown was a lot of money. As a child in the candy shop, you got a lot of mileage out of a halfpenny, which was a half of a penny. You could do an awful lot of variations on a very small amount of money in those days. So a half a crown, which was 60 half pennies, you could keep yourself going on candy for about a year, I think, on that. And that's a lot of candy. At any rate, we have decided this year to permit the children of our Hebrew school to determine which charities the money should go to, with the proviso only that one of the boxes will go to a Jewish charity and the other box will go to a secular charity. My choice of secular charity was Amnesty International, but I was overruled. However, I will try to do devious things through the school and make a suggestion that at least this is one of the charities that will be voted on. I know some of you shake your head because Amnesty International has a bad reputation as far as Israel is concerned, but it has an excellent reputation as far as Salvador is concerned, and Salvador needs all the moral help, not the corrupt and decadent help, but all the moral help it needs today, and therefore the children will decide which of the various charities should receive this money. Now, Shabbat Shekalim, as I say, points the way to Passover, and I have in front of me a summary of the decisions of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Rabbinical Assembly of America and the United Synagogue of America, of which we are affiliated. I have not received any information from the Reconstructionist movement, and this is the sort of thing that Reconstructionists don't usually talk about. We tend to talk about the values and the implications and the universal spiritual significance of Passover, but we have a problem this year because the first night of Passover is Saturday night, and what on earth does one do? It's the sort of thing that one ought to talk about, at least briefly. Those of you who wish to have more information and would like to call me or write to me, I'll send them a memo of this summary of the decisions of the Rabbinical Assembly. I don't know of anything beyond the Guide to Jewish Ritual, which Reconstructionists published some years ago, but is out of print currently. But that doesn't go into the details as to what may or may not be done on Passover. I think one of the problems is that unlike an Orthodox congregation, where you have a fair amount of monolithicity, one assumes, at least in an Orthodox congregation, that everybody is going to have more or less the same kind of Passover. At the SAJ, we cover the entire spectrum. There are some people who observe an extremely traditional Passover and who change all their pots and pans and knives and forks and glasses and crockery and push and pull and shove and work and go crazy a week before Passover, as I remember my mother doing. Others who watched their mothers doing this sort of thing many years ago took a vow that they would never do that because they wouldn't want to turn into the kind of person their mother was. I mean, Passover is a perfect festival for the obsessive-compulsive Jewish mother. Anyone who has got into this act knows what can happen. One can get too compulsive and too obsessive over Passover. However, I'm not going to read the list of prohibited foods. I just want to address myself to one single question that crops up this year. What does one do in view of the fact that the first Seder occurs on Saturday night? One of the things that we're doing is the SAJ, because the next day coincides with Easter Sunday. We are not going to have a communal Seder this year because it would simply be improper to have non-Jewish people involved in working on Easter Sunday. But the question from the Jewish point of view is, in traditional circles, under normal circumstances, on a normal year, that is to say, assuming that the eve of Passover was Wednesday night, the Bedikat Chametz ceremony would take place on Tuesday night. That is to say, one would have cleaned the entire house out, presumably, and made all the changes that one wants to do. As I say, at the SAJ, this is a vast spectrum. We have on the one hand those who are clinging very close to traditional Orthodox patterns, and at the other end, the people who keep probably nothing. Somebody once regaled me with the story of the fact that they believed in observing Passover, but not in believing Jewish tradition, and regaled me with the story of breakfast, bacon on matzah, which I thought was a very curious kind of combination. But it only goes to show that all sorts of variations are possible in a non-Orthodox synagogal context. I have other interesting stories, but I don't think they'll be appropriate at this moment. So we do have an entire spectrum. One member of the congregation tries to convince me each year that because he likes Scotch whiskey is kosher at Pesach. I keep on telling him that grain liquor is not, but he is convinced that if it's good for him, it has to be okay. So go fight City Hall. That is why we at the SAJ have not got into this in great detail, but we do have a particular problem this year. When Passover would fall on a Wednesday, Bedikat Chametz was on the Tuesday night, Orthodox Jewish homes would still serve bread for breakfast the next morning. If you ask why, because Judaism is a masochistic religion. That is to say, I've seen more damage done in Orthodox homes by the father of the house getting ready for Bedikat Chametz, totally wiping out all the endeavors of the Jewish mother in the previous 6 weeks, who was scrubbed and cleaned and vacuumed, and then the clumsy father sprinkles the largesse of crumbs all over the house while he's putting pieces of bread down in order to get the chametz picked up. Now, as a matter of fact, this paradox, which I remember very clearly in my own home, my mother worked for weeks before Passover. We were very poor. We couldn't afford a vacuum cleaner, but we were quite immoral. Each year, Hoover offered to come and lend you a Hoover vacuum cleaner for a day as a tryout, and we always had our tryout Erev Pesach. One has to remember, especially I always remind my young students in the Hebrew school that their teacher comes from a home where there was no radio. I remember the radio being brought in one day. It was a result of a few bar mitzvah lessons my father gave to a member of the congregation. I remember that radio. It was one of those old-fashioned semicircular radios, the ones now which fetch a fortune, if only we'd kept it, because it's an antique. I remember that radio very well. I remember the first time a telephone was installed in the house. I remember the years when my mother would make cheese during the summer and you had to be very careful to eat it quickly because there was no refrigerator. There was something called a larder, which was like a big wooden box which had a lot of mesh, and we hoped that a cool wind blew through, because if it didn't, your Shabbos meal went bad overnight. Refrigerator was a very late development, and some of you probably still remember these days. At any rate, Erev Pesach was the time when we decided to contemplate whether or not we would purchase a vacuum cleaner, and each year we decided against it for a variety of reasons, but after we'd gone through all the cleaning, of course, and the house was totally clear of anything like bread except one place in the kitchen where my mother had a little, what do they used to keep bread in bread bins, they used to call them in those days, and that bread was supposed to be used for two purposes. It was usually challah, which had been made in the home, for bedikat chametz, because there was a kind of an order of Jewish family spirituality. If the bread that had been baked from which challah had been removed was going to be used, in other words, you used religious symbols over and over again. To this day, in my office, I keep the lulav and the aravot from Hoshana Rabbah, which in Jewish tradition, in the shtetl, were used to stoke the fires which made the first matzah. I always thought that was a wonderful idea, the idea of the continuity of Jewish symbolism. The aravot, the willows of the brook, which were beaten on Hoshana Rabbah, were gathered together, and they were used to kindle the furnace which made the matzah shmura, the special matzah which was used on the eve of the Passover. So even though one can't set fires, unless you happen to live in Williamsburg, where the fire engines are extremely busy on Erev Pesach, because the Hasidim still burn their chametz in the street, and apparently the local firemen don't know about that custom. And so, of course, the sirens scream all day, Erev Pesach in Brooklyn, because of the fires. We just put, after we've had B'dikah Chametz, we put the aravot and the lulav, which is now, of course, very dried up, together and get rid of them, because you can't burn them today. You hope that the garbage will be removed before Passover commences. Starting fires on West 86th Street is not something I feel I can recommend. At any rate, when the whole house had been vacuumed and cleaned and was spick and span, and not a crumb of chametz was to be seen, my father would schlep a big crust of bread out of the box and go through the house like a sower, like someone who was sprinkling seed all over the place. The idea is, you see, and this is the paradox, the idea was that you began to clean the house the eve of Passover, the night before, but this is ridiculous. How, and what is more, you have to do it at night time. And what is more, you have to do it by the light of a candle. So if you look at the halakha is ridiculous. How on earth could any Jewish mother get rid of chametz, do in one dark night with one little candle? Well, we need vacuum cleaners and dishwashers and domestic help and unemployment insurance and accident, casualty, disability income. When you think of all the ramifications of getting ready for Passover, you even have to worry in case the help falls down and breaks her neck. You have to be insured for all sorts of weird things. So it can't be. And for years I worried about this, and it wasn't until I read a marvelous book by Jane Ellen Harrison, which describes certain customs which take place at Easter time in little islands in the Mediterranean, that I realized that the ceremony of B'dikah Chametz has nothing to do with getting rid of unleavened bread. It is a ritual of driving out the evil spirits before the oncoming of the vernal equinox. We should have known as such. And this is no recommendation to scatter chametz all over the house. I do it to this day. It's my job to put out the lumps of bread, to put into the brown paper bag with this wooden spoon and a feather, and don't ask me why we have a wooden spoon and a feather. I think this goes back to pre-Christian days. It has something to do with these customs of getting rid of the evil demons. It's a little bit like Shrove Tuesday, getting rid of all the fat and the grease and the flour. There is a basic feeling in human life that the old must be gotten rid of before the new is brought in. This may have been derived simply from observing that if the new corn was placed next to the old corn, the new corn would mildew. Maybe as simple as that. It may have been simply an observation of the fact that if you didn't get the old crop removed, some kind of bad luck, which may have had some actual concrete reality to it, but certainly a very deep-seated notion. So there are many, many customs all over the world in preparation for the vernal equinox, which is what we're talking about. At any rate, so this is not a recommendation to sprinkle bread all over the place. One should be rid of all kinds of chametz. But in order to perform the ceremony of B'dikah Chametz, which I say has a much more symbolic than actual physical implication, one places the bread at various points in the house, and one goes to the house with a candle for the ceremony of B'dikah Chametz. Now, some bread was left over in the bread bin for breakfast the next morning. You may ask why. The answer that I can give you only is that the Jews had nothing to preoccupy themselves with in the pre-modern era other than causing this kind of a complication. In other words, you already got rid of the chametz. The chametz was in a bag waiting to be thrown away, but kind of you had, by some legal fiction, a little enclave in the house where you had chametz. The idea is that there's a principle in Jewish law that you may not add nor subtract from what Jews are supposed to do. You may not keep 2 days of Shabbos, only 1 day of Shabbos. You may not keep 2 days of Yom Kippur, only 1 day. You must not add nor subtract. And since we are only commanded to refrain from eating chametz for the traditional 7 or 8 days, therefore to add to it by abstaining from chametz on the morning of Passover, before the Passover has set in, is a violation of Jewish law. So you must eat bread in those most peculiar of circumstances. And of course, did they have children running around up and down Where's my rucksack? Where are my books? Running up and down with a piece of toast in one hand and the school books in the other hand. Wait for the hold the elevator, with the bread being spattered all over the house. Did they know of these things in those days? Or was everything organized in a much more sedate fashion? We have given up on the notion in our house of trying to eat bread on the morning of the eve of Passover, because no matter how important it is not to add, the fact is that we also don't want to end up in Bellevue. That is to say, a line has to be drawn between obeying tradition and not going with sugar. It seems the obvious thing. Once you've done B'dikat Chametz, call it a day. What we've done is to introduce a slight modification onto the principle that one should be hungry before sitting down to the Seder service. Is not serving any kind of matzah, of any shape or size or form, and simply eating other kinds of food. It's amazing how much of an appetite one can build up on the various things that one can eat, and also the pseudo breads and the pseudo matzahs that one makes with pseudo flours and pseudo this and pseudo that. At any rate, however, this year we have a problem. And the problem is that the Orthodox Jews, the ones in Williamsburg, are going to have challah for the Shabbos before the Saturday night Seder service. They're going to have challah on Friday night, and they're going to have challah or something like challah for breakfast. They can't have anything, of course, for Saturday lunchtime, because that's too late.
How would they burn the hummus?
It's a very good question. They don't. They get rid of it. There is an alternative method which the Mishnah permits, that the bread may be scattered into the wind or simply thrown out. So obviously it's not burnt. Now, since chametz may not be eaten on Shabbat beyond 4 hours past sunrise, which is about 10 o'clock in the morning, Orthodox synagogues, very Orthodox synagogues, as my mother would say, the real thing, will start davening on the Saturday, which is the day on which Passover falls, very early in the morning, in order to be able to have the second Shabbat meal before 10 o'clock. So if you want to do it the real way, get up at 5 o'clock and jog, and then have 6 o'clock Shacharis and Musaf and everything else, and you can have your Shabbat lunch anytime between 8 and 9, as long as it's before 10 o'clock. I don't see any looks of rapt enthusiasm on behalf of members of the congregation to have an early morning jogging service at the SAJ. So we'll give that up. We'll give that up for the time being. One of the alternatives. My wife was extraordinarily relieved when, after much consultation with sources and aware of the fact that, with teenage children running around the house and hoping they're going to get rid of all the various pieces of chewing gum that adhere to various underparts of various tables and chairs and other commodities in the house, that one shouldn't ask too much from people. So we are going to observe the Sabbath this year without challah. The last challah is going to be used for the B'dikat Chametz and for Friday night and for Sabbath lunch at the proper time, that is to say 12 or 1 o'clock, we are going to use egg matzah, and I commend that principle to all of you. But if you would like to follow the more traditional custom, I'm very happy to send you a list of instructions. That is to say, egg matzah, which is known as matzah ashira, it does not qualify for being used for the Seder service, may be used in lieu of bread. And then you have no more problems about how much bread is around, how much bread isn't around. You get rid of your b'dikat, you do b'dikat chametz on Thursday night, and you burn or get rid of the chametz which was gathered together, and all other chametz you may have in the house some stage of Friday, and you start your evening meal with matzah ashira, with egg matzah. You see, the crazy thing about the other way of doing it is that obviously Orthodox Jews are not going to schlep all their chametz sticker crockery and pottery down on Saturday. So the entire house is already switched. The entire house is already switched to Passover crockery, but you have a loaf of bread, 2 loaves of bread on the table in a chametz stick basin. One could get to Bellevue very easily just by thinking about this sort of a complication. And I think it's much better. I'm going to take the position this year, I don't usually make these ritual recommendations, that everybody uses egg matzah. And that you make all your switchovers well before the Sabbath commences. There should be no more work being done on the Sabbath. As a matter of fact, even your cooking, strictly speaking, has to be done before Sabbath commences Friday night, because it's not Yontif. You can't cook from Saturday, period. So that all the cooking, all the knedlich and all the chicken soup and all the... So a lot of work is involved, and I don't see how any working lady can manage to get through this unless she takes a few days off, unless you've got a lot of very good help that's thoroughly insured. So, now of course you may say, aha, you see, he finally had to break the magic link. He stopped talking about the prayer book. Well, of course I haven't. That fooled you. As a matter of fact, all roads lead to Rome. And one of the things which fascinates me more and more about the Jewish experience is that no matter where you go from, you get to the same position. Any smallest, minutest cell or partial cell of Jewish experience can be cloned into the Shulchan Aruch, into the entire history of the Jewish people. Take any mitzvah, take any ritual, take any custom, take any prayer, and you will be able to clone the entire architectonic of Jewish theology, ritual, liturgy, and ethics. Because it is an organic system. And that is both its good point and its bad point. The fact that it's organic makes it so difficult to reconstruct. Because once you start reconstructing in one area, the entire edifice has to be reconstructed. And it's good and it's bad because you can't live with the whole thing. But in a sense, you can't live with the authenticity which the whole thing gave. And we still await a modern Jewish piety, a modern Jewish religiosity. We still don't have it. Many, many problems in its way. The entire project of what we are engaged in at this time of the year is precisely the point of the service of Shacharit that we are now at. If you just turn very briefly to your books, what is recited every day in the Orthodox synagogue, but which we do not recite, although this year, hopefully, we will have the traditional machzor on Yom Kippur, and we will introduce the Shirat Hayam, the song of the crossing of the Red Sea, which is the central myth of the Jewish people. It is found in the prayer book on page 329. Az yashir Moshe uvnei Yisrael et hashira hazot Adonai vayomru leimor ashira Adonai ki ga'o ga'a sus v'rochmo rama vayam. Then Moses and the children of Israel sang this song to the Lord. They said, I will sing to the Lord, for he has completely triumphed. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. This is the song which was sung after our ancestors left Egypt. The exodus from Egypt is celebrated every single day in the traditional Jewish liturgical year. Every single day this song is chanted, and those who chant it stand up. When the Jew stands up to recite traditional words, these words have an added meaning. We stood up this morning as we came to the end of the book of Vayikra. Chazak, chazak, v'nitchazek. It is a special spiritual aura. It is as if we are standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, standing, hearing the original revelation. And in Orthodox synagogues, traditional Jews stand up for the Kriyat HaTorah every Shabbat, every Yom Tov throughout the year. What we do when we stand up only at the end of each book is symbolic for the whole. It's pars pro toto. It's our way of acknowledging that these words have a special added sanctity. And so this song of the crossing of the Red Sea is sung every single day in the traditional synagogue, and it leads to the blessing on page 349. We've come across the affirmation of God is King, God is Creator, God is the one who reveals His law, and this most important blessing is the culmination of the notion of Exodus. Baruch atah Adonai Ga'al Yisrael, God as Redeemer, on page 349. The whole theme is the redemption from Egypt, the exodus from Egypt, and the redemption and the leading into the promised land. And many Jewish traditions enjoin that there must be no break between Ge'ulah and Tefillah. There must be no break whatsoever between the blessing Ga'al Yisrael and the commencement of the Tefillah, the 18 benedictions. Of course, Passover focuses even more strongly on this notion of redemption. Now, why is Passover so important? Why is the Spring Festival so important? Other festivals have prolegomena. Other festivals have introductory rituals and rites. We count 7 weeks before Shavuot. We have Solichot, penitential prayers, before Rosh Hashanah. In traditional synagogues, the shofar is blown at the end of the morning service throughout the month of Elul. But only Pesach has all these different special Sabbaths. All this preparation, all this focusing on what fundamentally is the vernal equinox, that point in the year where the day and night is equal in spring. There are 4 points in the year on which the religious imagination, both Jewish and non-Jewish, have lavished their attention. They are, as you know, the 2 solstices, the 2 points in the year when the sun stands still, the winter solstice and the midsummer solstice, where the sun appears to stand still. Its furthest point from us, the point when it's closest to us, before it begins to move back again. The word solstice comes from a word which means solstitium. The sun stands still. Those 2 points plus the 2 equinoxes, the 2 times when day and night are of equal length. Nothing could demonstrate more clearly, nothing could underline more clearly the theological point which we have been discussing for the last several weeks. The question of what it means today to say that God is one, or there is one God. In what sense can we affirm the unity of God today? The discussion relating to the meaning of what Rabbi Kaplan meant or means when he says that the world is so constituted as to enable human beings to achieve salvation. A central aspect of what he apparently understands by the unity of God. I lectured a couple of weeks ago at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia, and I tried out this new insight that we discovered a few Sabbaths ago, that we should do to this sentence of Rabbi Kaplan what Rabbi Kaplan in fact suggested that we do to all traditional writings which don't make sense in their subject-predicate form. That is to say, we apply what is now becoming known as predicate theology to them. We turn the sentence upside down. It's a well-known phenomenon that you don't understand something straightforward, turn it upside down, and sometimes you can understand it better. You can do that with people also occasionally. In other words, sometimes when you see things in a one-way sequence, things don't immediately become apparent. The principle was very simple. Instead of saying the law of the Lord is perfect, restoring the soul, we transposed the subject and predicate and said that which restores the soul and that which is perfect is the law of the Lord. You see, immediately this introduces a humanistic dimension, a humanistic perspective into the understanding of the origin of religion. Now, Rabbi Kaplan suggested that the universe is so constituted, the universe, this vast universe, is so constituted as to fulfill human needs. Some of us, myself included, have enormous difficulty with that sentence. What is the difficulty that we have with that sentence? That the universe is so constituted as to satisfy human needs, if only man will lead his life properly. Speaking of myself, it seems that it's the last vestige of the chosen people idea. That is to say, having acknowledged the fact that a modern theology cannot claim that there is one God who made a special and unique revelation to one people, and all other peoples can only have religion in deference to that original, pristine, pure revelation to that one people. That is the classical Jewish notion of revelation. God, the only God, the one God of the entire world, the only real God, spoke once at some point in the 13th pre-Christian century to his chosen people. And all other religious people don't have to be Jews, but they have to conform with the demands that that pristine, original, pure and unique revelation laid down for them, which, as those of you who are acquainted with Jewish tradition know, are what we call the laws that govern the children of Noah, namely Rabbinic Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, and I'm talking about contemporary Orthodox Judaism. I'm talking about Lincoln Square and the Jewish Center, right? Believe that the world consists of two groups of people. There are Jews and there are B'nai Noach, Noachides, N-O-A-C-H-I-D-E-S. The Greek word I-D-E-S means son of, you know? Just two. B'nai Noach. There are Jews and there are B'nai Noach. Jews must observe the entire revelation. B'nai Noach, that is to say, everybody else, all the Gentiles, no matter who they are, or what their claim to fame may be, need only observe the 7 laws given to the children of Noah after the flood, which include the injunction to refrain from incest, from bloodshed, from maltreating animals, and so on and so forth. It's a very grandiose, arrogant, and from a modern perspective, presumptuous doctrine to divide the world up into two classes, us and them being on a much lower scale. All that God wants of non-Jews is not to become Jews, but that they should obey these minimal ethical laws. It's something that most of us find enormously offensive, except insofar as it is studied as a historical phenomenon. We shouldn't get exercised if, we learn that people used to burn witches in the 16th century. What is important is that we don't burn witches today. We shouldn't get exercised because our ancestors believed that they were the chosen people. Any group of people who were pilloried and pushed and persecuted as the Jews would inevitably have conceived of themselves as chosen. It would be an obvious adaptational way of psychological survival. We shouldn't be embarrassed that they did once believe they were the chosen people. We should be embarrassed that Jews still think that they are the chosen people. Nor should we feel uncomfortable that people once believed that the world is so constituted as to fulfill human needs. It has been very hard for man to accept the full implications of the Copernican revolution, the Darwinian evolution, the Einsteinian revolution, the Marxist revolution, the Freudian revolution, did I mention the Darwinian evolution? In other words, we have lost our privileged position. And what does that statement demand? That the cosmos, the universe, is so constituted as to fulfill human needs. What does that statement demand other than privileged status for man, which is exactly what we are trying to rid ourselves of? The only privileged status that man can claim for himself, as I see it, is that man alone is self-conscious. But to go beyond that point of being self-conscious and to insist that that self-consciousness was written into the cosmos from the very beginning, and that therefore in some sense human self-consciousness, which as far as we know exists only in this little tiny speck of dust spinning on an off-center solar system, of an off-center galaxy, of an off-center segment, of an off-center part of a vast cosmos. To speak of our petty needs, aspirations, and drives and interests as having some cosmic significance seems to me to place Asher Bachabanu right back into the center of the religious agenda from which we have been trying to emancipate ourselves. I may be wrong, but that's how I feel. Anybody wants to make any comments or disagree, please feel free, yes.
I mentioned to Laney this whole situation about 2 weeks ago when you were talking about the bird's nests and the and man's obligation to take care of the animals. And I said there's only one way out of this in a reconstructionist situation, and that's to say that mankind is Jewish.
Well, I don't know whether mankind cares to hear that. I'm not sure whether mankind cares to hear that. You see, another one of the things that has been learnt in the last years, and if we haven't learnt it, then of a surety our children have learnt it, that there are other traditions in the world. There are other fine traditions in the world. There are other ethical traditions in the world. There are other moral traditions in the world. The Jew is not the only ethical animal around. This cultural arrogance, which invests so much of Jewish experience today, has to be superseded by a more modest claim. Rabbi Kaplan understands this only too well in vast sections of his writings. He insists for, yes.
Involving this question about the chosen people, you seem to think that this is not suited for the modern Jew. The concept of the chosen people and the traditional Jews have it. I think that in a certain way you are expressing a kind of a traditional liberal Jewish American philosophy, which seems to feel that anything you say very emphatically about Jews will insult somebody else's feelings. Somebody else meaning the Gentiles. I feel that the Jews' feeling about being the chosen people has to do with mitzvot and obligations, which not necessarily may impinge on the concept or outlook of other people. I think that other people have their own ideas about what is holy and important to them, which may certainly not take into account what we believe. I think there's no impingement. It has to do with a different concept of liberal and open living, where they will respect our idea of the chosen people, because it obligates us to certain things. And we will expect their right to live their ways, which are different than ours, not try to emulate them, not try to become like they are. And they will allow us our concept of the chosen people, no matter how smashed up we are, no matter how bad we are. They will say the Jews are the chosen people because they are doing certain things and they're living a certain kind of life and a kind of moral, which is not always suited to other people.
I hear what you're saying, but you know, since we're talking with the problem of collective grandiosity ultimately, which of course is closely related to individual grandiosity, I think even though the rest of the world doesn't necessarily take our claim as being chosen seriously, and I think all the historical evidence of the last 100 years indicates quite clearly that they don't take it seriously at all, there is something bad from the standpoint of the Jew to be so patronizing to the rest of the world. It reminds me of the fact that in the Egyptian language, for example, the word for human being and Egyptian are synonymous. That is to say, one who is not an Egyptian is not a human being. The question I raise is, never mind what damage the chosen people concept does to the Gentiles, very little as far as I can make out, except some of them seem to be rather jealous of it. And in fact, the church went out of its way to borrow the concept from us and to claim that the church, in fact, was the chosen people, and we have been rejected. There's no accounting for tastes. De gustibus non disputandum est. What does it do for Jews? What does it do to raise Jews and telling them that the world consists of two kinds of people, so that from the earliest childhood our children are indoctrinated in the belief that other peoples don't rate? Now, I think there's a moral issue there. I happen to feel very strongly, and as I say, since we're on the issue of grandiosity, far be it from me to extend the implications of where my personal opinions hold weight. I am not speaking either in terms of the SAJ as a whole, and clearly not for the Reconstructionist movement, because when I spoke at the college, Rabbi Eisenstein was there, and as I anticipated, he picked me up on this issue of the attempt to transpose the sentence the world is so constituted as to satisfy human needs, and my attempt to interpret that by applying predicate theology was not that the cosmos is so constituted as to enable man to fulfill himself, but that man has constituted himself in such a way as to find the universe, as to insist that the universe, as to affirm that the universe is a place where he may feel fulfilled in. Otherwise, suicide is the only alternative. That is to say that we have generated our own space. We have generated our cultural and spiritual space, which is none the less meaningful because we made it. Look at the equinox. The equinox is something which has no meaning outside of this globe. The fact that the day is equal to the night at a particular point in April is irrelevant from a cosmic standpoint, because it only applies to us. It is meaningless from the point of view of the moon, or of the sun, or of Mars. It is a purely random equidistance which exists from the standpoint of somebody who lives on this globe. And what the purpose of the different Sabbaths are, and the preparation for the Passover, is to generate a humanly created order of meaning around a random nuclear event which is meaningless outside of this globe.
Maybe it's not random.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. Now, I'm not silencing you, I'm just not giving you a chance to have another turn this week, all right? That's the benefit of this new method. You see, when you say maybe it's not random, I can't buy that, because you see, anybody who knows astronomy knows that there are billions of potential equinoxes and billions of potential solsticia scattered all over the cosmos, because all that this means is, from any particular point in which you happen to be in the cosmos, at what point do other celestial bodies make pretty mathematical patterns vis-a-vis you? But that is not something that is anything other than a random phenomenon. It's quite obvious. It will happen every so often that you will get pretty patterns. If you stand at different parts of the cosmos, there probably are more and prettier patterns than the ones that we have. I am only interested right now is what we Jews have done with Pesach. And what I'm suggesting is that this is a very crucial point in Reconstructionist thinking, which we're going to have to work through before we transmit to the next generation a modernized version of chosenness. Is the DNA a chosen molecule? I haven't heard any scientist of repute suggest that. It's a very marvelous, it's a very special molecule, but chosen? I feel that if we attempt to extend to the rest of the cosmos human needs, affects, and dispositions, all that we have done is to transpose the concept of chosenness from one kind of idiom to another kind of idiom. Granted that the attempt to come to terms with our grandiosity is a very complicated problem. Now, of course, Rabbi Eisenstein's objection, which I understood and I respected, was you can only apply predicate theology to the Bible. You mustn't apply predicate theology to Kaplan. But you see, you can't do that, because insofar as Kaplan unequivocally in various parts of his writing has de-anthropomorphized the cosmos only to place in the role of the supernatural God a kind of a quasi-supernaturalistic Bergsonian élan vital, a kind of a Casper the Friendly Ghost cosmos. In a sense, we're back to square one. And the point that I would like to stress is that this Festival of Freedom that we are celebrating is the result of a millennia-old attempt on the part of all of human beings, but specifically of our own ancestors, since we are talking about the Jewish dimension, to refuse to be overwhelmed by the randomness of the cosmos, to refuse to accept the vernal equinox as simply one more notch on the tree of time, one more year. We're getting older, we're nearer to death. But the Jew insists that each year that random mechanical mathematical pattern be metamorphosed into an affirmation of renewal, redemption, and creativity, to be continued next Shabbat morning. We rise for Aleinu on page 194.